Hello, I'm Dr. John Cruz, and today I'm going to be talking about daylight. In honor of our just having switched, many of us, to daylight saving time, I'm going to be talking about seasonal affective disorder. I will be talking for about 20 minutes. If you have questions while I'm talking, you can certainly type them in. This will be posted later on YouTube and Facebook. So again, the take-home message for those who want a brief message is seasonal affective disorder has 40 years of documentation, studies, research establishing its existence, and far and away the most thoroughly investigated treatment for this is phototherapy, bright light treatment. And several years ago, the American Psychiatric Association put out a statement that we should be promoting bright light treatment for seasonal affective disorder much more extensively because the evidence for it is at least as strong as it is for antidepressants in general, for depression in general. So that's a take home. So again, why we're talking about it this week is last weekend, many of us switched onto daylight saving time. Congress, actually the Senate, has unanimously passed a bill in the US to make permanent daylight saving time, so everyone would be shift ahead an hour from standard time, and we would not be shifting back and forth. That still has to pass the House and get Biden's signature or the next president's, if it takes that long, so that it isn't a fact yet, but it's coming. And the connection is that most of the theories and research on what's going on with seasonal affective disorder tie it in with the changes in circadian rhythms and shifting of rhythms. So this is a condition that, at least in the modern era, has a fairly precisely defined onset of when it was discovered. So Norm Rosenthal, a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, who himself suffers from seasonal affective disorder, published a study in 1984 describing the condition as a variant of depression with the seasonal pattern and the effectiveness of light treatment for it. There's been almost a cottage industry since then of people going back in time and finding documentation going back centuries of people recording seasonal patterns to depression. So it's not that this just emerged in the 80s, but it was actually a fairly controversial topic for at least a decade. So in 93, when I gave grand rounds on that topic, it was with the framing of, does this thing really exist, or is this just a made-up term? There is still some resistance to the notion. There was a critique published a year or two ago based on one study finding no apparent differences in rates of depression looking north and south or season of the year if you just did a point surveillance, crude survey of how many people are depressed. On the other hand, again, there are several hundred articles, epidemiologic, treatment-based, and others establishing that this is really an entity that exists. So it's officially classified as a variant of depression, so you have to meet the full criteria for depression, which includes meeting 5 out of 8 depressive symptoms for at least 2 weeks. The seasonal qualifier means that there has to be a consistent onset to the season, a consistent season to the onset of depressive symptoms, and a consistent season to the offset or resolution of symptoms, far and away most commonly in the winter. But there are some people with a summer variant, and other seasons may be possible as well. And again, for official depression criteria, the symptoms have to be prevalent for at least 2 weeks. With the seasonal qualifier, an added specification is that you have to have at least 2 consecutive seasons with this pattern without depression at other points in that time span. However, you are allowed to have, during the course of your life, other episodes outside of your season for depression. And some of the early research, and it's been substantiated over the years, has found that there are ways that people with depressive or seasonal affective disorder vary from the general depressive population. So one even more so, depression skews about 2 to 1 female to male in most surveys. Most surveys of seasonal affective disorder, SADs. And I will say SAD is a SAD acronym, not just because it spells out sad, but because, I'm blanking on, I'm going to get anxious about social anxiety disorder, was using those syllables before, or not syllables, initials, an acronym, before seasonal affective disorder was. They're both sort of sharing it now. Google search actually, at least my Google search, turns up seasonal affective disorder before it turns up social anxiety disorder. And an interesting other thing, not surprising at all, there is a strong seasonal pattern towards, if you check how many people are Googling the term seasonal affective disorder, it's a huge winter peak, and predominance of people in, at least in the US, from Alaska, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, are the 4 states that most commonly searched at. So, which highlights one of the things with seasonal affective disorder, there clearly is a variation in the northern hemisphere. It's the further north you go. In the southern hemisphere, there have been a few studies. The further south you go, closer to the poles, where there's more variation in length of daylight and restriction in daylight during the winter season, whichever months of the year that winter is. Commonly summarized is that the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder is about 1% in Florida and as high as 10% of the general population in Alaska. And I started saying that the patient population for seasonal affective disorder compared to general depression skews more female, skews younger, so particularly common in people in their 20s and 30s. And there's some features of, or symptoms of seasonal affective disorder that are much more common and sad than in regular depression. So particularly sleep disturbances are really common throughout depression, but insomnia is more common than hypersomnia or oversleeping. With SAD, something like 80-90% of people have hypersomnia, that they fall asleep readily at the end of the day and they sleep much longer than normal hours. Also overrepresented in normal depression, people can either lose their appetite, which is more common, or overeat. In SAD, it's far and away more people are overeating than lose their appetite, and it's particularly carbohydrate craving that's linked with it. And some studies have also suggested that sort of irritability or a reactive depression form is more common than just a SAD or an inactive or numbed out pattern. So in many ways, and other people have commented on this, that seasonal affective disorder resembles sort of a hibernating bear, that you're sleeping a lot, you eat a lot beforehand, and you're grumpy if you're disturbed. So that we still don't know the origins of depression in any format, but SAD is no exception to that. The theories have mostly worked on SAD being a feature of delayed circadian rhythms, and why that may happen particularly in the wintertime, and or disturbances of serotonin systems and serotonin receptor densities and transporter densities have been found to be abnormal in people with SAD and have shown to differentially respond to bright light therapy or others. Serotonin and circadian rhythm hypotheses aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, so both could be going on. So I'm going to talk the bulk of the session on phototherapy, just because it was, I think that's part of what made it unique and different, that here was a biological treatment that wasn't a medication, it wasn't ECT or giving your brain a shock, but it was just bright lights that seemed to effectively treat seasonal depression, and in fact treated it more quickly than our antidepressants or conventional methods work for traditional depression. And I think that caught public attention and fascination, and also probably resulted in some pushback from the traditional authorities or experts who this didn't fit in with their normal categories of what could help treat a mental health condition. And part of my interest, why I'm talking about this also, is I was in the early 80s, or shortly after Norm Rosenthal published the first description of seasonal affective disorder, I was involved in some research trying to figure out what parameters of light treatment were effective for treating people with SAD. So in those days, early 80s, most of our bright light treatments consisted of huge panels of usually incandescent lights. So they were delivering not just bright light, but also a fair amount of heat. So there was some question about whether it was just feeling warm and comfortable and relaxed that was the treatment response, or whether it was really the bright light. And also, even more so than in many medication trials, it was hard to think of logical placebos or alternative treatments to help sort out what were the important variables. So some of those early treatments, I mean, the benefit of those early days is that given this wasn't an established treatment yet, patient expectations as to what an effective treatment was were not sort of firmly established. So some of the research I was involved in used a bright red light, but not nearly as bright as the white light, and the subjects expected both of those to be effective. Again, the white light was actually a few orders of magnitude brighter, and the white light was more effective than the red light in treating people. So some of the outcomes of years of studies are, we know that bright light is effective, that it does need to be bright enough. It's the blue end of the spectrum, the visual spectrum, that's important. You don't need any UV light at all for this response. And now, when it's much easier with LEDs to have bright light sources at only one part of the spectrum, there are bright blue sources as well as bright whole spectrum white lights that are used for seasonal depression. And again, these LED displays have advantages of portability, of not overheating, and what else can I say about the characteristics of light? Oh, my favorite experiment of all in the studies is in the early days. Again, they had some small studies looking at the bright light worked for seasonal depression, but the question was, is this working by hitting your eyes, the retina, where we're getting visual information, or, light has effects on our skin as well, and there's a huge neural innervation for our skin. That was a plausible treatment route for phototherapy for seasonal affective disorder. So the study involved essentially swaddling people in burqas with opaque cloth over your whole body, with the eyes exposed to the light, versus the group who was in a bikinis with dark sunglasses. And that study pretty strongly indicated that it was the light exposure, retinal exposure, that was important for this antidepressant effect. And since that time, around that time, neuroanatomic studies found that most of the information from light that goes into our eyes, our retina collects the information, optic nerves take it back to the brain, the optic nerves cross at a place called the optic chiasm and go all the way, again, project information all the way to the back of the brain, or our occipital visual cortex. Visual processing centers are, that information gets processed first in the lambic and other midbrain centers before going to the cortex. But actually, there are a small set of fibers that go right from the retina and jump off right at that optic chiasm, or X, into the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is actually where the master clocks for circadian rhythms in humans, most mammals, exist. So there's a quick light input to the circadian clock. And again, the phototherapy effects seem to be mediated by those fibers. So other studies, most of the studies, and there's not complete consensus, there are some people, but early morning light, and bright means at least 10,000 lux, I'll get to that in a minute, for at least 20 to 30 minutes seems to be the standardized treatment that was adopted. There were people who did light therapy treatment at different times of the day. There was even one experiment in which randomly delivered light at different times, different days to see what was most effective. There have been some individuals who seem to respond either to evening light or even to random bright light. So, but more consistently, it's the bright morning light at a regular time. And many people with seasonal affective disorder start showing response within just a few days and are largely out of their depression within a week of starting this treatment. So again, it seems to be faster than most of our conventional antidepressants. So a few other things about the bright light treatment. So again, the intensity of the light is important, and humans have very adjustable pupils, so our pupil expands when we're in a dark room to bring in more light. Unless you do a lot of photography, you may not be aware of how well our pupils adjust or adapt, but a bright indoor light is on the range of about 200 lux. A lux is a measure of how many photons are hitting a square centimeter of surface, like your retina. Bright outdoor day is more than 100,000 lux. That's how many photons are hitting your square centimeter of your retina. So that's several orders of magnitude more than the 200 lux inside. Again, the effective lights that seem to be working for SAD, seasonal affective disorder, are about at least 10,000 lux for about 20 to 30 minutes. And the important thing I want to emphasize there is with the light source, it may look like a really bright light source, but with light, the intensity of light falls off with the square of the distance from it. So if you're twice as far away from a light, you're only getting a quarter of the illumination. If you are 3 times as far away, you're only getting a ninth of the illumination. So the conventionally sold phototherapy units, bright light units, are designed to operate within a certain range. And that range is usually about 2 to 3 feet from your face. So if you have a really bright light source, but it's 15 feet away from you in a big room, it's probably not doing you any good. On the other hand, just going outside, even on a cloudy day for 20 minutes and not wearing sunglasses, you're probably getting close to a good phototherapy treatment. I usually don't make specific recommendations, but one of the good, cheaper versions, so for years, many of the phototherapy units were upwards of $200. Philips Siemens, the biggest lighting company in the world, bought out, and I'm forgetting the name, I think it's Apollo Systems. So there were many little companies in the early 80s, 90s that did some of the basic research on phototherapy and seasonal affective disorder and built their own products. Philips Siemens bought one of those out, so it was a good product and well tested to begin with. And currently it's in the $75, $80 range, so a third of what many of the others are. So that's the Philips GoLite, G-O-L-I-T-E. It's portable, it has a battery backup, so it has a carrying pouch, and it has both at different models, but a blue light mode or a bright white light mode. In terms of a few other things about, and I'm about to sneeze at the bright light that I have on my face right now. Excuse me. So bright light. There actually is some research on using bright lights for non-seasonal depression. They do appear to work. Not as many studies, but about a dozen plus studies have been done with a mild to moderate effect reported. Bright lights have been used in a number of other conditions. Interestingly, studies about 15 years ago, 2 of them looked at bright white light, same as the phototherapy units, for people with ADHD. and found substantial improvement in core ADD symptoms, not just things that might be influenced by mood from bright light treatment. It's a little surprising there hasn't been more follow-up on that. And other treatments for for seasonal affective disorder include a number of antidepressants have been looked at. Wellbutrin has been looked at most extensively and has done the most promotion that it's effective for ADHD, but SSRIs and SNRIs have been found effective as well. Cognitive behavioral therapy approaches work well, although it's commonly used one advantage of a seasonal pattern to depression is you can predict when it's coming and try your approach ahead of time to abort or prevent that depressive episode from developing. There's some limited research showing that that can be effective, and I'd say more extensive anecdotal information. So I've certainly seen people with extensive histories of seasonal depression who did get good results from the lights and then use the lights usually starting in October, because November, December are highlights of onset of seasonal affective disorder symptoms. It reminds me of one other detail I didn't mention before. When I did mention in the Southern Hemisphere, seasonal affective disorder is clearly associated with winter, but not with Christmas. So one of the thoughts early on was, we're all just confusing misery around the holidays or the subset of people who have difficult times or difficult family relationships or difficulties with the commercialization or capitalization. So this is not just a holiday, Christmas time, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, winter regret association. It again is associated with day length and change of the day. I think I've said about all I'm going to say today on seasonal affective disorder, but have a bright and happy week ahead. Next week's topic is going to be on why I hate crimes, and it's hopefully more based on emotion research than just on politics, but I'll let you decide. So I'm not seeing any questions. That's all for today.